of a series of seminars run by the Family Justice Council looking at adoption in the 21st century. I'm going to deal with some housekeeping first, and then you can see our three illustrious speakers are on the screen in front of you. Just some housekeeping first. As I keep repeating, could I just ask that everyone who's not speaking or taking part keeps their cameras off and remains on mute for the internet. The seminar is being video recorded, and the recording will be published on the FJC website shortly. So you don't want to be seen having your cup of tea and your biscuit on the screen for the Family Justice Council. Delegates are welcome to tweet about the event using the hashtag FJC events. Just a little bit of background about these seminars. The idea of this topic was devised in 2019, which for many of us now seems like a lifetime away, when we were going to have a conference in Bristol for the day as a Family Justice Council event looking at various aspects in relation to adoption. Obviously, events overtook, and we had to postpone the conference in March and have had to postpone it twice since then as a result of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. It was then decided that we would split it up and have a series of seminars that we have today, tomorrow, and the next day, leading up to the Bridget Lindley Memorial Lecture, which is being given by Baroness Hale of Richmond on Thursday, which will be looking at the way our notions of family have been transformed over the last 3 decades. Dealing with today, we're looking at adoption in other jurisdictions. We have 3 excellent speakers, if I may say so, which I'm just going to give a very brief introduction. Firstly, Brian Sloan. Dr. Brian Sloan is a fellow in law at Robinson College, Cambridge, where he teaches family law, land law, and equity. He's written on a wide range of topics within child law, and his work on adoption has been cited with approval by the President of the Supreme Court in Re B and by the Irish Department of Children and Youth Affairs in their report on open adoption. And he's recently co-edited a special issue of the International Journal of Children's Rights on Article 5 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. He is our first speaker, and we'll be looking at Ireland and the wider common law world from the perspective of the approach to adoption in England and Wales. Our second speaker is Professor Julie Selwyn, who is the Professor of Education and Adoption at the Rees Centre in the Department of Education at the University of Oxford. She too has published widely on children's social care, including Beyond the Adoption Order, a study of disruption, and Pathways to Permanence for minority ethnic children. She provides advice to many agencies and speaks regularly on adoption at national and international conferences. She was rightly awarded a CBE for services to adopted children and children in care in 2015. And is currently working on an evaluation of the regionalisation of adoption agencies and also further work with Coram Voice. Our final speaker is Judge Annie Højmark, who is the Chief Judge of Svendborg City Court in Denmark. She studied law at the University of Copenhagen and graduated in 1982. She was first appointed a judge in January 2008, and since May 2014 has been Chief Judge at the City Court of Svendborg, one of Denmark's 24 city courts. She sits as a judge in family cases and works in both private and public law. Over the last 3 years, she's worked tirelessly on family law reform in Denmark and has developed close contacts with various organisations involved in the well-being of children. She is also ahead, as always, but an hour ahead of us at the moment because, of course, she's joining us from Denmark. So we've had to do some conversion of timings. So I'd like to invite those delegates that are here to be able to put their questions, if they have any, in the side chat bar during the event. And others can also like any questions posted by others. These will be monitored during the talks, and then we will have a plenary session at the end. So the plan is for the next hour and a half, just under that, is each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we will have about 25 minutes at the end to be able to pick in relation to the questions and answers. So without further ado, can I just do another reminder of those who've joined after we've started? Can you please take down your video cameras? Otherwise we have you up on the screen in front of us. And we want to be able to start with our first speaker, who's going to be Brian Sloan, Dr. Brian Sloan, and I'm going to ask for everybody else, including me, to take down their cameras so that Brian will be on the screen. Thank you very much, Brian.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and hopefully you can hear me okay. I suppose it's a particular pleasure of mine to be in such illustrious company, and also it seems particularly appropriate that Lady Hale should have a warm-up act lasting several days, and that I should be at the very beginning of it. Today, my brief has been to talk to you about adoption in Ireland and the broader common law world. Obviously, there's no way I can possibly cover anything like the whole common law world in the brief time that I have available, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to tell you something useful about Ireland, but also to give you the benefit of some of my more recent research, which I was conducting in Hong Kong and in the US before the pandemic took its hold. So adoption has had a very difficult and controversial history in Ireland, as many of you will know, involved delayed formal introduction of adoption until 1952, extreme secrecy, cruel treatment of unmarried mothers and children in homes, and mothers pressured to agree to the child's adoption. Many of you will know that the Mother and Baby Homes Commission of Investigation has recently reported, but I think the fallout from that will carry on for some time to come. But I think, as we'll see, the historical attitudes to adoption took quite a long time to subside and still have an impact today. And we can see to some extent similar trends in Australia. And I've put a reference on the slide to the forcible adoption of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and the placing with non-Indigenous families during the 1900s, which I think contributed to low rates of adoption in Australia as compared to the US and the UK. So I think there's very much a sense that the history of adoption has quite a long shadow, if I can put it that way. What about the numbers and the use of adoption? Well, many of you will be quite startled by these statistics. There were only 79 domestic adoption orders in Ireland in 2019, and you'll see from the slide that most of those were step-family adoptions. So we can already see that the character of adoption in Ireland is rather different from what we would expect in England and Wales from that alone. We can also look at the age profile, and you'll see there that although in England and Wales we've been placing emphasis on trying to get adoption to happen early in the life of a child, in fact, the age profile is much higher there in general. The numbers of children adopted from care have been historically low, but the hope is that they will increase due to legislative changes in Ireland that I'll discuss. And we can see there from Neri and Ower's work that the relationship between foster care and adoption does vary throughout the common law world. What about the notion of who can be adopted? Well, I think very notably in Ireland, the significance of the previous Irish constitutional protection of the marital family meant that married parents couldn't place their children for adoption even voluntarily. So it wasn't merely the case that adoption practice centered on unmarried mothers and the children of those mothers, but to an extent that was actually written into the Constitution. Now, in principle, any child under 18 can be adopted, and there's no reference to parents' marital status under the Adoption Act 2010, Section 23, as it was amended in 2017. Should also make just a brief reference to the idea of adult adoption, which again is another concept that would be alien to us in England and Wales, but is actually available in most US states. And it's often a mechanism for formalizing existing relationships. Another distinctive element of adoption in Ireland is the question of who actually makes the adoption order. It's actually the Adoption Authority of Ireland, which is a quasi-judicial body. There is court involvement, though, where there are issues regarding dispensing with consent and the involvement of the father. Of course, in the US, where the process has been described as universally judicial, we might say that that is closer to what we're used to. What about the actual status of child welfare or best interests in the adoption process? Well, there's been a move from best interest being the first and paramount consideration to being simply the paramount consideration in Ireland following the 2017 amendments. I put the exclamation mark in there because, as many of you will know, the idea of treating the child's best interest as the paramount consideration is by no means straightforward, and that's particularly the case, I think, in the adoption context. Ostensibly, though, it is consistent with the requirements of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 21. Significantly, the word paramount doesn't yet appear still in the Hong Kong Adoption Ordinance. Now we come to the issue of parental consent and the involvement of fathers in the adoption process. This will obviously be hugely contentious. There's a lot of detail there on the slide. In general, the previous threshold for dispensing with parental consent meant that the threshold was high, and that was seen as making the adoption unviable as a child protection measure. The general approach of the 2017 reforms, which took effect on the 2010 Act, mean that there's supposed to be a lowering of that threshold. And again, you can see some of the details there. I won't go into detail here, but I'm happy to answer questions. But I think what I would say is that much depends on the particular facts. I think there are amendments that might make adoption less likely to occur on particular facts in the 2010 Act as amended as compared to the previous law, but others will make adoption more likely to happen on particular facts. It's interesting that there is a fairly open textured discretion conferred on the court in Hong Kong about when to dispense with consent. So the Irish approach seems to be rather structured, and to go into a lot of detail, the Hong Kong approach seems to be very open textured. I think we probably would say that we're somewhere in the middle with our test that the welfare of the child requires consent to be dispensed with. That at least does have some content, albeit that it's very much open to interpretation and has been. A related issue, of course, is the involvement of fathers in the adoption process. And some of you will know that this is a particular interest of mine. Now, it is still the case that the consent of a father who's not married to the child's mother, who is not a guardian or other person having charge of or control over the child, is still not actually required in the first place. So you don't even have to dispense with it. But I think significantly, the unmarried father is more likely to have guardianship, as they call it, now than in the past. And unlike in England and Wales, the unmarried father in Ireland can acquire guardianship without either the consent of the mother or a court order, based on a period of cohabitation with the mother. It's also the case that even where a father doesn't have guardianship, which again is the Irish term for parental responsibility, there is a basic duty to take such steps as are reasonably practicable to ensure that every relevant non-guardian of the child is consulted in relation to the adoption, except in limited circumstances. And as I point out in my 2020 paper, I think that's rather significant. Of course, in England and Wales, in most cases, the father will be involved in the adoption process, even if he doesn't have parental consent. But a lot of the content of that general duty to involve the father has been judicially developed. Whereas I think it's very significant that Ireland have written a requirement of involvement, except in limited circumstances, into the legislation themselves. Well, what about the voice of the child who's to be adopted? We would generally see this as being familiar in England and Wales, the general sense, insofar as practicable in respect of any child who's capable of forming his or her own views, to ascertain those views and give them due weight, having regard to the age and maturity of the child. They take a rather different approach in Scotland, where consent of the adoptee aged 12 or over is basically required unless the court is satisfied that the child is incapable of consenting. The general rule in the US is similarly to require consent of the adoptee of a certain age in the US, although the age varies between states. Of course, though, from the English perspective, we would say, well, actually, most of the children that we would regard as being suitable for adoption, certainly adoption from care, would be well below that age of 12, so that actually a formal requirement of consent for a child aged 12 or over wouldn't really make very much difference in England and Wales. But I think the comparison is interesting. What about the vexed issue of open or closed adoption? Well, there is still, formally speaking, a transplant model of adoption that's used in Ireland, as there is here. But I think it's significant that there is really no provision at all in Irish legislation for the exchange of relevant information or contact between members of the birth and adoptive families. So adoption remains, legally speaking, a closed process. And there are informal mechanisms through which information can be gained and contact can be facilitated, but it really doesn't have a legislative basis. And of course, it's the absence of information in respect of children who were previously adopted from mother and baby homes that's been one of the main points of controversy. The political future of the issue of the exchange of information about adoption in Ireland is, I think, uncertain and is likely to be contested. And I think, again, we can see that the history of adoption in Ireland has had a particular impact there. So I'm conscious that this has been a whistle-stop tour through the notion of adoption law and practice in Ireland and in a few other places. As I've said, I'm very happy to take questions if you'd like to ask me something, but I think I can draw some threads together, which is to say that adoption law and practice in Ireland has been heavily influenced by attitudes to the marital or natural family. It hasn't historically been seen as a viable child protection mechanism in the way that it has in other jurisdictions, including our own. As I've said, that is likely to change following the impact of the 2017 amendments. But as I say, the law has changed in that respect, and I think practice is likely to change with it. As for the vexed question of open adoption, though, I think the future of that looks extremely uncertain. And I'll leave you with the slide that has lots of references on it, which I've referred to throughout the talk. I'm conscious that that was a very quick overview, and I'm happy to answer questions to the extent that I can. But thank you again for inviting me, and I'm very much looking forward to the other presentations this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. That was extremely helpful, and as you say, a whistle-stop tour. Can I ask Julie Selwyn to perhaps get her slides up on the screen? Julie's going to talk about domestic adoption in Europe, the tensions between consensual and non-consensual adoption, and the debates on children's and parents' rights. And Brian, if you don't mind taking your camera down, and then we'll all have our cameras up at the end for the question session at about 6:05. Thank you.
Can you confirm you can see my slides?
Yes, we can. I can.
Good. Well, I'm delighted to be speaking as well, and I'm picking up some of those themes from Brian's talk. We didn't know what each other was going to be speaking about, so it's interesting that we have very similar thoughts about things. I think the first thing I should say is that there are many difficulties in comparing practice across Europe. Adoption is a national concern, and there's no EU common policy. It's understood differently in different countries, so there is still simple adoption, where financial and legal ties remain with the birth parents, and full adoptions, where all responsibilities are transferred. But I think one of the key differences I'm going to be talking about is whether adoption is integral to a child protection system, or it's still being used to meet the needs of infertile couples and infants. I suppose another thing I should say is that the data across Europe is very poor. There is no requirement to collect it across the EU. So we have here the data from 2004 to 2014, and you can see that adoption, all different types of adoption, is decreasing in all countries. But the proportions of domestic and inter-country adoption vary by country. So if you look at Portugal, for example, 99% of their adoptions are domestic, and 1% is inter-country. In comparison, Sweden and France have only 20% domestic and 80% inter-country. We can also look at the numbers. This is 2014, when the UK was seeing quite high numbers of children adopted from care. But even this doesn't tell us the whole story. We can't see how many of these adoptions in the other countries are child adoption or adult adoptions, as Brian has commented on. We can't see how many are the simple type or the full, and we can't see how many are relative adoptions, because the majority of domestic adoptions in France and Germany are relative adoptions. We can also look at them in a different way. If we look at them as a proportion, as a percentage of the number of children adopted per 100,000, this gives a rather different picture. In this kind of mapping, Bulgaria has the highest number of the highest proportion of children adopted, 58 per 100,000 children. Denmark has 53 per 100,000 children, and just for a comparison, the UK is only 33 per 100,000 children. As Brian has alluded to, there are also big variations in practice. So who can adopt? Well, in 13 countries, same-sex adopters are allowed. In Norway, only a foster carer is allowed to adopt a child from the care system. In 15 countries, you have to be married. In other countries, the age differs. So you've got to be no older than 42 in Sweden to adopt a child, but it ranges between about 40 and 60. And some of that variation is to do with the supply of children, the aim of adoption, and which children are being adopted. So again, in some countries, it's thought that certain children are unadoptable. Sibling groups in some countries are not thought to be suitable for adoption, or disabled children. Again, those are things that are quite foreign to our sort of ideas of finding the right placement for children in our care system. Brian also talked about the age at which children have to give consent, ranges across Europe, and in Norway, from the age of 7, you have to be given the opportunity and have to consent from 12. Access to records varies greatly from the age of 16 to 25. And I'm going to come on in a short while to some of the issues when anonymous births are taken into account, where children have no right to any information about their identity and their birth parents. So in all the countries, we see this, the debates and the arguments are going backwards and forwards about the rights of the child being balanced against the rights of the parents, and the right to life against the right to identity. And I'm going to look at that in 2 particular areas: anonymous births and confidential adoptions, and adoptions without consent. I'm sorry, my slides are no longer moving.
Let me just see whether we can find some help for you, Julia. Hang on a second.
There they go. Sorry. Sorry, they just stopped moving for a moment. So, anonymous births. I don't know how many people are familiar with the concept of baby hatches. These are boxes that a mother can leave her child in, her baby in, and abandon the baby in a place where they know somebody is going to find the baby. So these baby hatches are attached to police stations, fire stations, hospitals. Germany currently has 100 of these baby hatches, although their constitution states that all citizens have a right to know their origins. The growth of baby hatches across Europe, they're appearing particularly in Eastern Europe, but they're also in the Netherlands and other countries, has led to the UN expressing concern. The UN has expressed concern on several grounds. Firstly, it gives relatives no chance to offer the opportunity to care for the infants. And secondly, there's concerns that men and relatives are actually taking these infants away from the mothers and placing them in the baby hatches without the mother's consent, because it's done anonymously. And of course, there is no identifying information left. So in many countries, these baby hatches are increasing. So the debates are about the rights of the mother. Does the mother have the ultimate veto to say, I want to leave my child, I want to have an anonymous, leave my child somewhere in either a baby hatch, or I'm going to talk about the anonymous births in a minute, and the child's right to know their identity. And as Brian was talking about, the rights of fathers and the extended family to be informed of the birth. So confidential births, that's something else we don't see in the UK. It's an historic practice. It's now available in about 1/3 of European countries and was introduced in Germany in 2017 because of these concerns about the baby hatches. Now, in these confidential births, a mother can go into hospital anonymously and give birth in a safe environment, so they have good medical care and postnatal care after the birth. But in France, they don't have to say who they are. They can put an X on the birth certificate. In Germany, they have to leave identifying information in the hospital, which the child is able to access from the age of 16. But it's still anonymized data. There's no names or anything like that, but there are some details about why the mum is having this confidential birth. Confidential births are now in a third of European countries. So again, that's something that's on the increase. But the rights of children in this are more clearly protected in some countries than others. And I just wanted to highlight these 3 English cases, which you might be familiar with, where the mum concealed her pregnancy for various reasons, for rape, for not wanting a child, and the decisions that have been made in the court. Coming from a social work background, rather than a legal background, I find the cases interesting because as a social worker, I see it as a social work practice issue about ensuring that the mum had good counselling and access to good legal advice. But these cases seem to be appearing more in the courts now. And there are issues about delay for the child. How long should these appeals go backwards and forwards? And do mums still have the right to be able to say, I don't want to reveal who the father is? Should mothers have that right? There are also adoptions without consent. So, as you may remember, the Pettit Committee was set up because of the concerns that particularly Eastern European children were being admitted into care in England and then being adopted without consent. That committee looked at the issue and found that the UK was certainly within all the European legislation and human rights legislation. But again, we've got very little detail, and I just wanted to draw people's attention to the difficulties of trying to compare UK practice with practice elsewhere. So unlike the UK, all parental responsibility can be removed during care proceedings, and therefore consent's not needed. It's not needed for an anonymous birth or those hatches, and if parents' whereabouts are unknown, consent's just assumed. The committee also identified 3 mechanisms. So there's something called lack of parental interest, and that really varies by country. So in Portugal, for example, if a parent has not visited a child or not shown any interest, a lack of contact for only 3 months, consent can be removed. There's also parental misconduct, so things like abuse and neglect. And obviously, a few countries also have if the child's best interest demands it. So all European countries allow adoption without consent. So every country allows it, but very few exercise the power in the same way as the UK does, in the same way as making adoption central to the care system. But things are changing, as Brian alluded to. I think the focus on permanence and the evidence on children's needs for stability have challenged that dominance of reunification with the family, sometimes as in what's perceived at all costs, the dominance of the blood tie. And I wanted to look at Norway as an example of this. There was an expert report that said we need to focus on relationships, not blood ties. And the law began to change. It was made possible for adoption from the care system, but only by the child's foster carers, with open adoption introduced in 2010. But judgments have been going in both directions. In one case, the child's right for permanence was prioritised over the mother's Article 8 rights in a major case. But in another case, it went the opposite way. with the father's rights prioritised. And this was a father who'd never lived with the child and who was seeing the child on 4 contact visits a year. So there's been very different interpretations of the best interest principle, which led really to a major case in Norway, which is this Strand-Loben case, where the mum asked for an abortion at 6 months, the child was born, the mum entered a mother and baby unit, but there were lots of concerns because the mum wasn't caring well for the child, and the child was placed with foster parents. Care order made, multiple appeals, backwards and forwards, but by the time the boy was 3, the foster parents asked to adopt, and the decision's upheld and the child's adopted. Then the mum starts to lodge further appeals on behalf of herself and the boy under her human rights. And in this final Grand Chamber judgment, the majority concluded that there had been a violation of the mum's Article 8 rights, but it was based on the procedural irregularities rather than adoption itself. There were 3 dissenting judges, and there's lots published on this case, and it was very high profile because the mum was using social media in her case. So she had the boy next to her on social media videos appealing to the general population that this adoption had been unfair. So although the Grand Chamber judgment was in her favour, the adoption order remained in place. However, there was a public backlash against it, and there was a reliance in the original hearing on outdated evidence. So there was no updated assessment at the time of the adoption, and the child was 10, but was still unrepresented in the case, and his interests were assumed to be the same as his mother's. So this is just I'm not going to read all this out because of lack of time, but the judgment was it's high time for the court to reconsider its approach regarding the issue of assuming that the natural parent is going to act on behalf of the child. So children should have their own best interests regarded, and there needs to be changes in procedural practices. So, adoption remains a controversial option. It's very difficult to make comparisons. We're not comparing like with like. The welfare systems are very different. So, for example, I've talked about Portugal a little, which uses many adoptions from the care system, but they only have 4% of children in foster care. Most of the children are still in big institutional, religious institutions. EU countries have legislation in place for domestic adoptions with and without consent, but they're infrequently used. The pressures to change are coming from many of the Swedish studies on the long-term outcomes for children who remain in the care system, where irrespective of the social policy or the welfare system, care leavers have poor outcomes across Europe. Thank you.
Very much, Julie. I'll just let you take your PowerPoint down.
They just keep getting stuck.
Well, once you've done it, you've been able to use lots of applauses that have been going across your PowerPoint on the new MS Teams clapping thing. Can you take it down? There we are. All right. Thank you very much indeed. Can I just ask everyone to take down their screens, please? Can they take down their video cameras? Thank you very much indeed. Now, the last speaker is Annie Høimark, who's going to talk about the Danish adoption system, how it works, the role of the judge, and the dilemmas and non-consensual adoptions. So, Annie, should we get your... Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, and I want to start with thanking the Family Justice Council for inviting me. I'm very honored to be with you and get this opportunity to tell you something about the system with non-consensual adoptions in Denmark. And to the participants, I want to thank you for your time. And you might have to excuse my language because I don't speak that very often about this field, which is not a daily thing for me. But I will try and get you through the non-consensual adoptions of Denmark, which is a topic I have chosen. I've chosen this part because it's very, very actual, a big thing in Denmark right now, because the government have been out with a wanted reform of this. When children are domestically adopted in Denmark, many of them come from the children at risk, the children that are in care orders. And I wanted to show you how many children and young people that are placed in care order in Denmark. As you can see, the numbers are decreasing. We have in 2019, 13,600 children and young people that were placed in care. And almost 20% of those were placed without consent. Most of them, I think, are placed in foster families, and some of them are placed in institutions, but most are placed in foster care. The local authorities in the municipalities, they have to pay for this. And even that the numbers of children and young people placed in cares are decreasing, the costs are increasing. As you can see, from Danish kroner 4.9 billion to 6.0 billion from 15 to 2019. And if you want to get that in English pounds or British pounds, you should divide with 10, around 10. The numbers of adoptions without consent in Denmark is, as you can see, very low. We only see a very few non-consensual adoption cases in Denmark, and I think from a political view, that is a problem. And as you can see, from 16 and up, it is increasing in numbers. And to the right, I have put up how many of the children are placed with non-foster families. What has been the most common is that the children are placed in foster families that later on wants to adopt them. I don't have the age of the adopted children here, and we have very few statistics on this, so it has been quite hard to find these. And if I look one place, I get some numbers, and if I look in another official statistics, I get other numbers. But this is my best guess or my best count. The candidates for adoption is the children at risk. And every year between 180 and 200 children are placed in care before their first birthday. The government have announced that they want more children to be placed in care and to be adopted. And that has been kind of a controversial way to put it. But as the minister said, children only have one childhood. And it's a change of policy that they want the law to be in a way that children should be adopted at an earlier age. Of the smaller children, we have the vast majority of them are placed in foster family, and they are placed very shortly after birth, some of them right after birth. And 57 are placed with parental consent, as you can see, and 30% are following a decision made by the Municipal Children and Youth Committee. I will tell you a little later about what that is. And then we have 13% of emergency placements decided by the chairman of the Children and Youth Committee. And that is when you can only have an emergency placement if there's a risk that the parents will go in hide with the child, or it's a something has happened, maybe a domestic violence case or something like that, where it's really a risk for the child to stay with the birth parents, and then we make an emergency decision. The way that the adoption order or the adoption decision is made is that the Municipal Social Services Department makes a recommendation, and it's a written recommendation, and it's worked very thoroughly through a period of time. The social services have made it as a expert recommendation of placement or expert recommendation of adoption. And in that expert recommendation, they have focused on the child, they have focused on the family as a whole, and they have focused on the network. If they can make a placement, a caretaking order for the relatives, they have to look into if that's a possibility and maybe even adopt the child to some from its close family. The child's opinion on the placement or the caretaking order or contact with the parents should always be looked into. So it's a legal thing that they have to, in this expert recommendation, they have to make their best effort to put in the child's perspective. They have to talk to the child, look at the child, visit the child in order to look into the child's perspective. When there is a meeting in this committee, as you can see, they meet, and when there is a meeting, the parents participate, and they have legal representation as a lawyer that is free for the parents. The child, if we have an adoption order, the child is represented by its own lawyer. So as we heard before with Brian, or was it Julie, here the parents, the birth parents, they don't represent the perspective of the child. The child has a status of its own and has a legal representation of its own. And if the child is above 12 years old, 12 years or older, it's he or she is invited to come and speak for itself and are represented too. And when the committee meet, it's a committee that are a judge who acts as a chairman of the meeting. I have done that in several meetings. Then we have 2 child experts, and we have 2 local politicians. And each of the participants have 1 vote. And in order to make a caretaking order or to make a recommendation of adoption, 4 out of 5 have to vote for it. when there is making, when this committee have recommended adoption, it goes to the National Social Appeal Board, which is kind of an adoption authority, as we heard about before. And it's independent under a minister, and it is making a decision whether they can approve adoption or not. And if the parents are not satisfied with the approval of adoption, they can appeal it to the court. But the important thing to notice here is that when the National Social Appeals Board have made their decision, the child can be placed in the adopted family. So it doesn't have to wait for the court to speak. The criteria for placement without consent are a clear risk of serious damage to the child's health or development. It's the same criteria that we use when we make a placement order. So if you could make a order for placed in care, you have one of the criteria for adoption fulfilled. Then it has to be rendered probable that the parents are permanently incapable of caring for the child. And then the most important, I would think, is adoption is in the best interest of the child in terms of continuity and stability in the child's life. And important to make especially rendered probable that the parents are permanently incapable of caring. That requires a parenting capacity assessment with a prediction assessment. The prediction, this prediction assessment is somehow similar to your risk assessment. It may be based on serious or chronic mental illness of the parent, but it can be mental retardation, prolonged abuse, and lack of parenting capacity established with older siblings. And I think the cases that we have had so far is where we see that the oldest child, or maybe the two oldest children, were put in care at a age maybe 3, 4, 5, 7, whatever, and they were doing very poorly. And then when it comes to the younger children, adoption is considered, and then we can come to a adoption recommendation. Adoption to the foster family is, as you can see in my earlier numbers, is the most common. And adoption by the foster family where the child is already placed is a solution that has been used in some situation. The condition here is that the child's bond to the foster family is so strong that it would be harmful to the child to sever such a bond. And then the foster family is willing to accept the child as their own, and it is what the child wants. Before the Minister of Social Service went out and introduced the new reform in Denmark, she had talked to quite a few former children that had been former placed in care, and all of them said that they strongly wanted to be part of a family. They wanted to be a full member of the family, and that really meant something to them. They have expressed very clearly that they wanted to be part of a real family and not just be a foster child. The Danish government's new 2021 initiative is called Children First. And the headline is a safer home for children and more rights for at-risk children. And it's very true that the headline also is a family that is not only on loan, and that comes from the youngsters that they have talked to. These young adults that had been formerly placed in families, they could all tell stories about being moved from one place to another, from one foster family to another. All these moves of these children from one place to another happened without their consent. It happened often even without an explanation to the child, why is this needed? And on its way, this child or a given child lost its history of their own childhood. When you have moved several times as a young child, there are only left a few photos. No continuation is left, and you lose the relationship to the ones that have pieces of your own story. These young adults told stories about being a young adult without a family network to celebrate your high school graduation, to help you move into your first apartment or put up your shelves or collect your first IKEA furnitures. So the ambition of the government is to give the children a safe home for the rest of their childhood. And then they have done it with relaxation of requirements for adoption without consent. And I have to say, this is just a proposal so far. It's not been enacted yet. And more children must be given a new family from the outset. So they want infant adoptions. Adoption must be used more. And they are talking about making the decision before the birth of the child, which would be quite earlier than what we see today. And then when a child has been placed in care for more than 3 years, adoption has to be considered. And they base it on Norwegian and Swedish studies that shows that adopted children do better than children placed in care on all parameters. And that has to do with their future and the set off for their future life. Other things that the government have proposed is that children should have legal standing in this committee, and in the case itself from the age of 10, where it's currently 12 now, and which means that they will have their own they will have a right to come and speak for themselves from the age of 10. And children should be allowed to refuse contact with their biological parents. Children over the age of 10 who has been in care for more than 3 years should be allowed to request to stay in care without throughout their childhood years, for the rest of their childhood. So children should have a right to speak for themselves and should be listened to. And another important thing is that foster families that adopt a child can receive the financial support for the first year of the adoption. so that it won't be financial needs that make this impossible. Dilemmas that are dealt with here in Denmark is that how should children's legal rights be strengthened without weakening the parents' rights too much. This is a balancing that I can tell that every country is struggling with, the rights of the children balancing to the rights of the parents, the birth parents. There's no easy question to that, and the government tries to find the balance with their new proposal, and we don't know it will become an act yet, but we hope it will. We assume another thing with the children's rights and the parents' right is that behind all this there is an assumption that the public welfare system can do it better than the parents, than the birth parents. If we put children in care, we assume that it's best for them to be there, and it's better than it would be to stay at home with the birth parents. And even if the birth parents got a lot of help. It's very hard to make a proof of that. Another challenge is, can we find enough adoptive families, and can we find the right families? The foster families often get supervision and support and extra support for their child. And will they lose that if they adopt the child? That's a worry for many adoptive families, that they won't get the supervision and support that they need. Another really obstacle there has been is that the municipalities haven't been skilled enough to make these adoption cases. Often municipalities are small, and they are small authorities, too small to gain experience, and many of the smaller municipalities are in areas of the country where there are a fair share of the social problems. And how do we deal with that? Should we have a regional system, or how should we make adoption happen the same way all over the country? So even if a small country like Denmark, this is a challenge to deal with the legal act of this. And a question can be, does the decision rest with the right bodies? Is this committee and the national board, is that the right place to be? Many of you will probably think, is the local politicians the right persons to deal with decisions like this? Are they biased? I can say my personal experience is that they are not biased. The judge is a participant in the meeting in order to ensure the rule of law. And I'm not sure that this is the best system in the world, but so far it's a system that we have got, and I think it's working as it is, but I'm sure that a lot of things could be done to make this working even better. And I would be delighted to answer your questions if I can, but so far this was what I had prepared for. Thank you.
Annie, thank you very much indeed for giving us a look through the window as to how adoption works in Denmark. Can I ask for Annie and Julie and Brian to put their cameras on so that we can all be on the screen, and we can perhaps move now to the questions and answers. There's Brian. All right, now, thank you all very much indeed. The first question, you may not have seen as you've been speaking, but the chat bar on the side has been quite busy with comments and questions that have been taking place. Can I ask one for you all, which has been posed by Maggie Jones? How is the adoption of sibling groups managed where older children can express a view, but younger ones may not be able or old enough to do so? Brian, do you want to start with that, as you've had the longest rest, I think?
I suppose the advantage of the consent of the child, not being an absolute requirement in either England or Ireland, and indeed it being a necessary but not sufficient condition for the adoption even of an older child where it is required, means that essentially it's only one factor, and you can take that into account, but decide, I suppose, that if they are to be adopted as a family group, and that is to be the option that best suits all of their welfare, then it allows you to balance things appropriately. I mean, I suppose it's hard to comment without specific case examples, but I think in general that is in the nature of an open textured welfare test, meaning that it's only one factor.
I agree with Brian, because it would also depend on the social work assessment, because, for example, the older sibling may be saying, I want to be placed with all my younger ones, but the assessment may be that that's not in the younger children's best interests. If, for example, there's sexually inappropriate behaviour going on amongst, from the eldest to the youngest, or there's or one child is being scapegoated in that family group. So I agree with Brian, it's a balance, but generally we would want siblings to be placed together.
Yeah, I can say that in the assessment, it must be looked into whether a placement order should be for all of the siblings, and if you can, you would try to place them together. But some children can have a very specific need that's not the right place for the other ones, and then you can separate them, or the group can be so large that nobody can take, for instance, a foster family can't take the whole group, and then you have to split the group and then make sure that they have contact.
Thank you, Annie. The next question is for Brian. I'm sorry if you can't see me. There seems to be a problem with the technology, but importantly, you can see our three speakers, I'm told. Brian, again, this is taken from the chat bar. Do you think the impact of the national apology for the mother and baby homes and an increasing focus on the needs of the child will drive any change in Ireland?
Yes, I think we're only just beginning to see the fallout of that whole report, because there is even controversy over their treatment of evidence and their treatment of the testimonies of mothers who gave evidence in relation to that. So I think it really is one of the most significant features of the history of child law and practice relating to children in Ireland. So I'd be very surprised if we didn't see the effect of that carrying on for some time to come. Yeah.
Julie, Annie, I don't know if you want to add anything from what Brian's just said.
No, I think he's answered that fully, yes.
All right, well, one for Annie, again from the chat bar. What's the role and priority of kinship care in Denmark? For example, care by grandparents with legal powers, duties to them to support the aim of permanence.
Well, I'm not sure what the priority is. Of course, it's always looked into if there is a close relative that can take care of the child. And it could be grandparents and it could be other close relative. We call it network care. Yeah, I don't know if that answered the question.
So within the wider family?
Yeah, it could be a wider family. Yes, it could. It could be a sister of the mother. It could be I don't know if it could be a cousin. I'm not sure, but it could be wider family. Yes, it could.
And do they have enhanced powers in this jurisdiction? There's a jurisdiction to make a thing called a special guardianship order, which gives often wider members of the family enhanced powers to be able to manage the day-to-day decisions for the child.
No, I'm not sure we have that. No, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. So I don't want to say yes or no.
All right, Annie, I'm not just picking on you, I promise, but there's just one question just come in on the chat bar, and then I'll come to Julie from the president of the family division, which says, in Denmark, if the parents do not agree with adoption, how long does a contested hearing before the committee last? And if the parents deny that, are they harming the child? How are the contested issues of fact determined? So.
Well, I can tell you that a committee meeting that lasts for about 2 hours, maybe, yeah, that's it. And then the meeting in the national committee, the national committee where they have the next step, I guess that's a meeting of 2 or 3 hours. And it's not hearings like you have for 20, 30 days about this question. It's all written down, and it's not proof. You don't proof it in the meeting. You just have a short meeting. So what takes the time is the assessment period. It's not the meeting itself. And as I said, when adoption is recommended, you can place the child with the adopted family. So it's not delayed by the court procedure.
So it's placed before the procedure. The child can be placed before the procedure starts, or
yeah, before the court procedure starts. Yes.
Julie, a question.
Sorry, I wanted to ask a question about that. So if the parents are contesting the facts of the case, where does that happen?
Well, they have to contest the fact while the assessment is done. And one of the things that are often part of the committee material is all the letters about worrying. I'm sorry, I don't have the right word for that, but if you as a professional, a teacher or a neighbor are thinking that a child is at risk, you have an obligation to tell the social services. And all these letters of concern, they are part of the written statements. And of course the parents can comment it, but it doesn't have to be proved because it's there. And the social services look into it, but what is looked into most is psychological testing of the parents or psychological testing of the child, and It can be observation of in the home, but it's all written down. And we have read it before we enter the meeting.
It sounds very different than I can feel audible gasps.
Yes.
People who will be attending this meeting. It's very different cultures. All right. Yeah. Julie, in countries where adoption is not regarded as part of child protection policy armoury, how can permanency be achieved for children whose parents are hopeless?
Yes. Well, I think that's part of the debate that's going on across Europe because of the evidence from Sweden and some of the other Nordic countries about the much better outcomes for adopted children in comparison with those in long-term foster care. From our other research here on the subjective well-being of children in care seem to do pretty well, really. It's when they reach 18 and leave care that cliff edge of care happens, and they haven't got, those adults around to support them. My children now are all grown up. They're all in their late 20s, early 30s, but they still need me as a mum. It's amazing how often they still ring me up for things on a whole range of issues. And you don't stop being a parent just because your child is now an adult. I see June Thorburns written in the chat that adoption isn't a magic answer. No, it's not. It's the right answer for some children, and we need to think as well about how we improve the whole care system, and particularly for care leavers who entered care later and where adoption has never been an option for them.
Brian,
I should just say as well that the outcomes for care leavers are the same across the world. Irrespective of which country we're talking about, there are poor outcomes for care leavers.
Brian, do you want to add anything in relation to that? Hang on, you're on mute.
No, sorry, I'm happy with Julie's answer to that. I think that was a very comprehensive answer, and the issues obviously are the same across multiple jurisdictions. Yeah.
And Annie, what about you? Is there anything that you want to say from the Danish?
Well, that exactly what Julie said was what I tried to illustrate. And in Denmark, we talk now about right now about how can we give this foster care children after care when they turn 18. How can we kind of help them so the foster family can still be there as they are caretakers, even the child has grown up and become an adult. And that was the thing about being, have a family that can, celebrate you, help you, drive you, let you use the car, this and that. Yes.
And be a grandparent for the next generation.
Yes. And all the young adults that I have talked to and the government have talked to, that's exactly the thing that they really talk about. They want a family of their own. So not these paid for people that leave them when they turn 18.
Annie, can I just ask a question from your perspective, and then I'll go to Julie and Brian on the wider perspective. But how do you deal with continuing contact with the birth family after an adoption order has been made in Denmark?
We have in the legal system, the act, it says that the birth parents can apply for getting a court order to have contact with the child after the adoption. But when you go behind the act, what it says is that this is made for children that have been in a foster family and mainly, not only, but mainly for children that have been in a foster family and then is adopted by the foster family. And along the placement in the foster family, there has been a regular contact with the birth family. And why should this contact stop just because they are adopted? So in these cases, it's an option, but it's not as obvious if the children are adopted when they are infants or small children, that they don't have any recognition or memory of the birth family. And another thing is that you can get a court order so that you can keep contact with your, for instance, grandparents or others that have been close to the child when it grew up and were in foster care. So that's a possibility, but we don't have that much, that many cases about it. But it came into law, I think it was in 2015. And I actually have a court case about it right now.
And do you have any contacts of letterbox contact? I don't know if you know what I mean by that.
Yeah, that can be part of it too. What I mean is physical contact, but you can make it as a letterbox or a FaceTime or whatever, email contact with the child. But I haven't seen any decisions about it, but there might be some.
Thank you. And I don't know, Julie or Brian, with your wider angle in terms of other jurisdictions as to how contact with the birth family is dealt with in different jurisdictions in adoption context.
Well, in most of Europe, there's very little contact because it's still working on a model of confidential adoptions, with children being found for infertile couples rather than the best family for the child, as in what we've just been speaking about in the Danish context and UK context. So there's most are still confidential, but that's not true right across the world, obviously, because in Australia, contact is mandated. In New South Wales, in Australia, you can't be adopted without mandated contact.
Brian, have you got anything you want to say about this?
No, just to emphasize that I expect that there will be significant developments in Ireland on this issue, but really they're coming from quite a long way behind in terms of statutory services of this sort. It all seems to be rather voluntary, and even the recommendations were made in 2019 on the issue are pretty light touch, as I said on my slide. So very much watch this space, but I think again it will feed into the history surrounding mother and baby homes.
Perhaps just one final question before we wrap up with Julie and then with others to talk about your last sentence and your last slide, Julie, is you say, but pressures to change in terms of things. Can you just perhaps give a little bit more information about that rather enigmatic sentence?
Well, I think the pressures are coming from various places. So there's the huge decrease in inter-country adoptions may put pressure on European countries to think about domestic adoption, because there'll be pressure from middle-class parents, middle-class couples wanting to adopt, and the supply of, sorry about the language, but the supply of children from Russia and from China has decreased. So there'll be pressures domestically. There's the pressure from theory and from research about what's best for children, the need for stability and the better outcomes for adopted children. There's the pressures around just changing the nature of what we mean by adoption in the 21st century. We've just been talking about how our views of contact are changing, the rights of children to be separately represented, the rights of children to have a voice. All these will make adoption something that will be very different, I think, in the future.
I don't know, Annie or Brian, whether you want to just add anything briefly in the closing minutes to what Julie has said. And Annie.
Well, I agree with Julie that that domestic adoption will probably be some kind of a pressure, and as it is obvious in Denmark now, it's something that the government wants in order to protect the children. And I think these kids that's been placed in care, they will speak up and they will ask for better solutions for the children to come. So I think it will come from the middle class parents, as Julie said, but it will also come from the children that need a better solution than they had for themselves.
Thank you. And Brian, anything that you want to add to what's been said?
Not much to add, I don't think, but just to emphasize how much I've enjoyed the discussion, and I'm very grateful to be. Thank you for your chairing.
Well, a timely, we've got 3 minutes left. Well, I hope those who've attended have found this seminar, the first of 3, as fascinating and useful and insightful in terms of opening the window in terms of what goes on in other jurisdictions. It has certainly stimulated debate in the chat bar, and the discussion, I have no doubt, will continue and will feed into the seminars that will run during the week. So I'd like, on behalf of everyone who's attended, to thank our 3 speakers, Annie, Julie and Brian, for the enormous work that's gone into their presentations, and also for attending and delivering them all beautifully on time. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope that you'll be able to attend some of the seminars going on later on in the week. Can I just say briefly some thanks? These events don't happen without a lot of work by a few people, in particular Paula Adshed and Daphne Wilson from the Secretariat Support at the Family Justice Council have been working tirelessly to get this event going, and also Jenny Beck and Maria Kavanagh, who've been watching the questions in the chat bar. So thank you all very much, and very much look forward to seeing those of you who can attend the discussions and the seminar tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye. Bye-bye,
Thank
Annie.
you.
Bye, Brian.
Bye.